There is a moment in the ministry of exorcism that no one prepares you for. Not the smell, not the voices, not the physical violence that erupts in a room where something ancient is being confronted and cornered. Those things you can read about in a limited way in the accounts of priests who came before you. You can brace for them intellectually even if your body never fully cooperates when the moment arrives. The moment I am talking about is different. It happened during one of the most severe possession cases I have ever worked. The individual on the table had been in this state for what we would later determine was years of progressive deepening oppression before the full possession manifested. The room had gone through 3 of the phases I have described in other contexts. The smell, the temperature shift, the eyes. We were deep into the right. The entity had been pressed by the authority of the prayers to speak, and it did. It did not threaten me. It did not try to frighten me with the things these entities typically attempt during this stage of the confrontation. Instead, it paused, and then it said, in a voice that carried with it an unmistakable quality of contempt, something that stopped the entire room. Not as something it feared, but the way a man who has lived in a city for 10,000 years would describe the streets to a tourist who has just arrived with the casual, intimate, bone-deep familiarity of someone for whom that place is home. And what it described was nothing like what any of us had imagined. I will get to what it said, but I need you to understand something first. Because what I'm about to tell you is not a ghost story. It is not religious theater. It is a composite of what I have encountered across 20-plus years of exorcism ministry, cross-referenced with the theological tradition that the Church has held since its founding, and confirmed in ways that I still find difficult to speak about without pausing to collect myself. My name is Chad Ripper. I am a Catholic priest, a Taoistic philosopher, a formerly trained and authorized exorcist. I did not approach this particular topic because it was theologically interesting or because I thought it would make for compelling content. I'm addressing it because in my work I have encountered too many souls who have no real understanding of what they are moving toward if they do not change course. And the demonic, in its moments of compelled revelation, has provided details about that destination that the Church's tradition confirms and that no rational person should simply ignore. Stay with me, because what comes next is going to disturb you. Not because I want to disturb you, because the truth is disturbing and someone has to say it without softening it into something comfortable and therefore useless. Let us begin. What every priest learns, and almost none will say, I want to tell you what the Church actually teaches about hell. Not the cultural version, not the version filtered through Renaissance, paintings of devils with pitchforks, or modern theology that has quietly decided the whole concept is too uncomfortable to engage seriously the actual teaching, the theological structure. What the greatest minds the Church has ever produced actually concluded after lifetimes of prayer study, and in some cases direct mystical encounter, because until you understand what the Church actually believes, you cannot understand why what I witnessed in those exorcism rooms is so significant. Hell, in the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, and the broader Catholic tradition, is not a metaphor. It is not a psychological state. It is not a symbol for the experience of radical separation from community or meaning. It is a real place, a real state, a real condition of existence that begins at the moment of final unrepented and unreconciled separation from God at death. And it is permanent, not temporary, not provisional, not subject to revision based on accumulated good intentions or the mercy of a God who eventually overlooks the will of a creature that freely chose rejection. This is where modern culture has made its most dangerous error. It has decided that a loving God would never allow permanent consequences. It has confused love with permissiveness. It has confused mercy with the abolition of justice. And in doing so, it has removed the one warning sign that has historically been the most effective motivator for the conversion of souls who were drifting toward the edge. When I entered seminary, I was not a man who had experienced hell in any direct sense. I was a student of ideas, a student of arguments, a student of the theological architecture that supports the Church's claims. I believed in hell the way I believed in the existence of Antarctica. I had not been there. I had never spoken to anyone who had been there, but the evidence of its existence was compelling enough, and the testimony of people I trusted was specific enough, that denying it would have required a motivated irrationality I was not willing to adopt. Then I began to encounter the demonic in direct ministerial context. and something shifted. The demons know hell. They know it the way you know your own bedroom in the dark. They have been there. They are in some sense, I will explain in a moment, inextricably connected to it, even when they are operating in the material world on their various assignments. And when they are pressed, when the authority of the right forces them past their preferred deceptions, they sometimes say things about that place that the entire room absorbs in a silence that lasts much longer than it should. I want to tell you what the tradition teaches first, and then I want to tell you what I have witnessed that confirmed, expanded, and in certain specific ways deepened that teaching in ways that I could not have arrived at through theology alone. The traditional theological account of hell identifies what the church calls the pains of hell. There are two categories, and the distinction between them matters enormously because most people only think about one of them. The first is the pain of loss, the poina damni. This is the permanent, total, and irreversible loss of the beatific vision. The direct experience of God, which is the only thing the human soul was created to ultimately receive, and which once lost permanently leaves in its place something that the tradition describes not merely as emptiness, but as a positive wound. The absence of what you were made for, experienced not as blankness, but as a tearing, a permanent deprivation, whose intensity exceeds any physical suffering precisely because the soul knows in the full clarity of its unshielded intellect exactly what it has lost, and that it will never recover it. St. Thomas teaches that this alone, purely this, absent anything else, would constitute a suffering beyond the capacity of language to fully communicate, because the soul in that state is experiencing with total clarity what it chose against when it still had the capacity to choose otherwise. The second is what the tradition calls the pain of sense, the physical dimension, the positive suffering that accompanies the spiritual. I am not going to construct a theological argument for this in a format like this one, because that would take considerably longer than we have. But I will tell you that the Church's teaching confirmed across Scripture, the Fathers and the greatest theological minds, the tradition has produced, is that this dimension is real, and that it begins immediately on the first day. What does the first day look like? That is the question I want to spend the next several sections answering, because what the theological tradition says, what the mystics have described, what I have heard compelled from the mouths of entities who know this place by direct experience. When these three streams of information converge on the same description, that convergence is not something I am able to dismiss, and I do not think you should dismiss it either. The first hour, I want to be precise here, not dramatic, precise. The Church teaches that the particular judgment, the individual judgment of each soul at the moment of death, distinct from the final general judgment at the end of time dies, is instantaneous. It occurs the moment the soul separates from the body. There is no interval of unconsciousness, no transition period, no gradual dawning of awareness. The soul, the moment it departs from the body, is immediately in the full possession of its intellectual capacities, operating without the limitations of a physical brain. It knows where it is. It knows where it is going. It knows why. This is one of the most underappreciated and most important details in the entire theological account of what follows death. The soul does not arrive at judgment confused. It does not arrive disoriented or only partially informed. It arrives in a condition of supernatural clarity, the same clarity that the demonic possesses in its natural operations, full intellectual apprehension, instant complete understanding, which means that what the soul knows in that first moment, in that first instant after death, is the totality of the situation it has chosen into. It sees its own life, every act, every omission, every hardening of the will, every moment where grace was offered and refused, every time mercy was extended and turned away from, not in a distorted way, not filtered through self-justification or rationalization, in the same unfiltered clarity with which God sees it. And in that instant, the soul judges itself. This is what the tradition means by the particular judgment. God does not impose a verdict from outside the soul's own understanding. The soul in the clarity of that moment comprehends with perfect lucidity what it chose and what that choosing means. The judgment is not external to the soul. It is the soul's own clear-eyed assessment of itself in the light of truth it can no longer avoid. For the soul that is lost, that moment of clarity is the beginning of something that never ends. Now, I want to get specific because the tradition, and I'm drawing here on Aquinas, on the mystics who received direct revelations about these realities, on the confirmed private revelations that the church has not repudiated, and on certain things that I have heard in the context of the rite that I have never spoken about publicly before. Now, the tradition gives us specific details about what follows that first moment. The first experience of the damned soul in the teaching of the great theologians is absolute solitude. And I do not mean solitude in the way we use that word when we describe an introvert's pleasant afternoon. I mean a solitude of a depth and quality that has no analog in human experience, because it is not merely the absence of other people. It is the absence of the divine presence that even in the lives of the most hardened sinners on earth provided a kind of background warmth to existence. A metaphysical companionship that pervades all of created reality simply because God sustains all of created reality in being at every moment. In hell, that sustaining presence is experienced as withdrawn from the soul's communion. The soul is sustained in being because the tradition is clear that God does not annihilate souls. Annihilation would be a mercy the damned do not receive, but sustained without the quality of presence that makes existence in any way bearable. What remains when that quality is removed is not neutral. It is not simply nothing. It is the experience of an absence so total that every human experience of loneliness, isolation, or alienation is to it as a shadow is to the object that casts it. I have asked the question in the context of the rite. I have asked what that first moment feels like. I do not do this for curiosity. I do it because the answers compelled against the entity's own will serve the ministry by giving those present a visceral understanding of what is at stake. And what I have heard on more than one occasion in more than one language from more than one entity that I have established has been in that place is consistent, unnervingly, precisely consistent. The word that appears most often across different cases, different possessed individuals, different exorcism sessions spanning years is this abandoned, not tormented, not burning, not punished in the way we might imagine a child imagines punishment. Abandoned with a completeness and a permanence and a totality that reduces everything else, all the positive suffering, all the additional pains to secondary status. Because the primary wound, the wound that underlies all the others, is simply this. You chose against the only thing that could make existence bearable. And now you know it, and you will always know it, and it will never change. What the demons revealed about the architecture. I want to pause here and address something in their own domain. It is a sophisticated question and it deserves a direct answer. The Church's theology of compelled revelation, in the context of the rite, is nuanced on exactly this point. It is not merely that they sometimes lie. It is that lying is as natural to them as breathing is to us. Our Lord himself identifies the devil as the father of lies. And this is not poetic language. It is an onlogical description of a being whose entire orientation is against truth. However, this is a crucial distinction that the tradition draws very carefully. There are moments in the rite when entities are pressed by the authority of Christ operating through the prayers of the church, pressed in ways that compel truthful response. Not because the demon becomes honest, but because the spiritual authority bearing down on it is so absolute that even the will to deceive cannot fully function. In these moments, the things that emerge carry a quality that is entirely different from the ordinary speech of a manifesting entity during exorcism. Those who have worked in this ministry long enough develop a discernment, a felt sense of when the compelled truth is operating, versus when the entity is attempting to manipulate even within the constraints of the rite. I am not asking you to take my word for this. I am asking you to note that what I have heard in those moments lines up with extraordinary precision with what the theological tradition developed over 2,000 years by men who had no access to my case files independently arrived at through reasoned scripture and the church's defined teaching. When testimony matches independent evidence of that quality and that precision, the convergence has evidential weight. I am a trained philosopher. I do not make that claim lightly. Now, what has been revealed about the structure of hell that goes beyond what people typically imagine? The first thing is that hell is not uniform. This is something the tradition has always taught, and that every serious theologian has affirmed. Aquinas is explicit about it. but it is something that popular imagination almost completely ignores. The damned do not all occupy the same condition. The degrees of punishment correspond with precise justice to the degree of culpability, the degree of the sin, the degree of the rejection of grace, the degree of the harm done to others. The soul that spent a life of casual indifference to God and died in that state does not occupy the same condition as the soul that spent a life in the deliberate, informed, knowing rejection of grace, the cultivation of evil, and the active corruption of others. This is not a comforting distinction in the way some people want it to be. It does not mean that any form of hell is tolerable. It means that the justice of God is perfect, something that the tradition insists is actually a cause for awe rather than complaint. Because a God whose justice was imperfect would be a God whose mercy was also imperfect and whose love would ultimately mean nothing. The second thing, the pain of sense. The positive active suffering beyond the pain of loss begins at the moment of death for the soul and intensifies after the final judgment, when soul and body are reunited in the resurrection. The tradition teaches that the resurrection is universal. Every human being who has ever lived will be resurrected. The damned will be resurrected into a state in which the body permanently and perfectly expresses the condition of the soul. And that reunion, the tradition teaches, is not a mercy for the damned. It is an addition to their suffering. I have been asked in interviews what I think about that. My honest answer is that it is one of the doctrines I find most difficult. Not because I doubt it. I do not. But because the full weight of what it means is almost too large to sit with for long periods of time. The third thing I want to describe is what I have heard about time and hell, or rather about what replaces time. Because one of the consistent details that has emerged across multiple compelled disclosures is that hell's relationship to time is fundamentally different from what we experience here and from what the tradition describes of heaven. In heaven, eternity is experienced as a fullness, as a plenitude in which every moment contains complete joy, rather than as an endless linear sequence. In hell, the tradition's account, and what I have heard confirmed, is that eternity is experienced not as fullness, but as an endless repetition of the moment of judgment. The soul does not move forward through time in the way we move forward through life. It experiences in an ongoing and unrelenting way the clarity of what it chose and what that choosing cost, not as a memory revisited as a present reality that does not pass. When I first heard this described in the context of the rite, I did not have a theological category for it. I went back to Aquinas afterward. I went back to the mystics who had received revelations on this subject. And what I found was that the tradition had been saying exactly this for centuries in slightly different language, and that I had somehow not fully absorbed it until I heard it from a source that had no reason to say it, and every reason to say something else. The three doors that lead there, and why most people walk through them without knowing. I want to shift now from the description of hell to something more immediately practical, because the purpose of everything I have told you in the first 4 sections is not to generate dread for its own sake. Dread without direction is just suffering. What I want to give you is dread with direction, the kind that has historically produced the most significant and lasting conversions, the kind that moves people not toward despair, but toward the only actions that can change the trajectory. There are 3 primary spiritual dispositions that the tradition identifies as the conditions most predictively associated with the loss of the soul. I have seen all 3 in my pastoral and exorcism ministry. I have seen them in people of every educational level, every social class, every degree of formal religious participation. And I want to describe them honestly because in my experience, most people who are in one of these conditions do not know it. The first is presumption. Presumption is not the same as confidence. It is not the same as a healthy trust